Hello, I'm Ken Robinson, and I want to say just a few words of introduction to my new book, You, Your Child and School. I've written this book specifically for parents to offer some information which I hope they'll find helpful on what's going on in education these days, on the kind of education I believe our children really need to make the best of their talents and make their way in the world around them, and also to offer practical advice and strategies to parents on how they can get that kind of education for their children. Obviously, people have very different circumstances. Some people live in affluent neighbourhoods with hired help, and others live in more stringent economic circumstances in neighbourhoods with fewer facilities. So, a book like this can't address the detail of every situation, but what I hope we can offer is practical advice which people can apply in whatever the situation is that they find themselves in. Parents have always worried about education, and they're right to, because education does have a huge influence on the way our children grow and develop, on how they come to see themselves and the talents they develop or don't, and how they make their way in their world around them, the lives they go on to live. Parents have always been concerned properly that their children get the right kind of education. I find these days, though, that parents have some other things on their minds which are more peculiar to the times that we live in. For example, a lot of parents are very worried about the pressures of testing in education. Education has become very competitive in recent years, perhaps more so than previously, and there's a lot more testing going on. Well, what's it all in aid of? Is it a good thing or a bad thing, and how should parents respond to it? Parents are often worried about how the curriculum in schools seems to be becoming more narrow. Programs they value in the arts, for example, in the humanities, in physical education seem to be being cut. They worry about the impact of social media. This is quite new, of course, in the lives of young people, and a lot of our young people do spend enormous amounts of time online. Is that a good thing or not? How would you think about that? But one of the extraordinary things I found that's happening in education, has been for a while, is that we're seeing less and less recess time, as we call it in America. In other words, children have much less time than previously just out to play and being physical. Well, what are we to make of that? And is it important that we restore recess and play, particularly into elementary schools? Parents worry about bullying, for example. Bullying's not new. It's never been good. It's not new. You only have to look at reruns of Back to the Future and Mean Girls to see that. But there is a new cast to it now, which is the insidious nature of online and cyberbullying, which can be anonymous and really very toxic. So how do parents deal with that sort of situation? And also, more generally, how should parents deal with their relationships with the school, with the most important people in the school from the children's point of view, with the teachers? I believe we need to have very constructive and positive partnerships between families, and the best schools do encourage them. So on what basis should parents work more closely with teachers? How can they get involved in the life of the school as a whole? If parents are concerned about the policies affecting education at the district or the state level, what can they do to influence them? Are there things that parents can do collectively as well as individually? And what about organisations like the Parent-Teacher Association? How should parents themselves relate to those organisations, and how can they become involved? So it's often for parents, I believe it's a complicated and daunting landscape to contemplate. So what I've tried to do in the book is to set it out as plain as possible. And I ought to say, by the way, I'm speaking as a parent, not just as somebody who's worked in education. My wife and I have 2 grown children of our own. We're about to have our first grandchild, and I know this is a very personal matter. I think often of education a bit like the healthcare debate. You can hear politicians arguing about healthcare, the Affordable Care Act here in the United States, and arguing about the pros and cons of personal insurance policies and all of the rest. It's too easy at this high level of argument to forget that we're dealing with people's lives here, with families, with loved ones. And in education, that's that way. Politicians are fond of talking about international league tables and economic imperatives, but education affects our children. This is the system that influences them when they walk out the door every morning with their backpack on and their sandwiches there for their lunch. And our concern as parents is what type of time are they having, and is it well founded, and what counts as a good education? How would you know a good school if you saw it? And if you were to make a choice, on what basis would you do it? So these are big issues for families. I know it because of our own experiences, and I know it from all the people I've spoken to. So Your Child in School is meant to be a practical help and a guide to how to navigate this rather complex system and situation. Do you stay in it? Do you try and change it? Or do you get out of it and do something else entirely? I hope you enjoy it. It's been a pleasure to write the book, and I ought to say, just as a final word by the way, this isn't meant to be a book about how to be a perfect parent. You know, I have 2 children of my own with an internet connection, and I frankly wouldn't have the nerve. I've left that to the Tiger Mums and Dr. Spock. But I do hope it will help you to navigate the education system and get the kind of education for your children that they need and deserve. Thank you.